send it over, Lucas. Thank you so much.
Generally, thank you so much for having me, folks. It's very exciting to be in this Zoom room with you. As Generally said, I'm a postdoc at University of Toronto, Mississauga, and I'm super excited to share with y'all some of the work that I've been doing on conversion therapy. Oh, I think I hear. If it's okay with everyone, just to mute. I'm terrible at if I hear a noise, I immediately lose my train of thought. Thank you so much. Okay, so super excited to be here. I will talk for the first 30 to 40-ish minutes, but by the end, I want to reserve time for Q&A and conversation. That's always my favorite part of the presentation. So please do keep your questions ready for when I finish the presentation because I want to engage with y'all. So I began my academic career in Holocaust studies, actually. I looked mostly at the antecedents of the Holocaust, looking at how Christian scriptures and Christian theology laid the seedbed for the Holocaust. And then I looked at the aftermath of the Holocaust, looking at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between Holocaust survivors, their kids, and their grandkids. But given the current political, social, religious, landscape, some might refer to it as a hellscape in which we find ourselves, I shifted my focus to really look at white Christian nationalism, more specifically looking at white Christian nationalists' understanding of gender and sexuality, and particularly in the context of conversion therapy. And so whenever I talk about conversion therapy or really most topics related to white Christian nationalism, I always want to preface my talks with a statement about my desire to put a lot of the terms and a lot of the language I use in quotation marks, right? I want to signal that I don't believe or I don't agree with a lot of the language or the terms that white Christian nationalists use. And so I want to put quotes around seemingly everything, but at a certain point, when you put quotes around everything, quotes somewhat lose their meaning. And of course, the term conversion therapy is sort of case in point, right? There's no conversion involved in conversion therapy, and there's no therapy involved in conversion therapy. And I always say that, folks should not have to go to therapy after going to quote unquote therapy, right? And so there are the quotes there. All this to say, I'm going to do my best not to put quotes around everything. And in either case, I digress. So, thinking about conversion therapy, and I want to offer first a vocabulary sort of list that both conversion practitioners, conversion therapists use, and also the language that folks use when referring to conversion therapy in academic and activist and survivor and ally communities. And so for conversion therapists, the language that they typically use falls under, there's maybe two categories that these folks use or draw upon. The first is more religious, or I guess religiously coded language, and then the other one has this other sort of valence of respectability. And that second category, to again offer you a few of the terms that these folks use, some of the language that they use instead of the term conversion therapy includes reparative therapy, change therapy, reintegrative therapy, reorientation therapy, gender exploration therapy, and desistance therapy. Conversion practitioners know the optics of the term conversion therapy, right? They know that if you're using that term, typically most folks who are familiar with the term, which is most folks, know that this doesn't work, that this is a sham. So instead of using the term conversion therapy, they draw upon this other lexicon to again offer a valence of credibility or respectability. Of course, when you do some digging and you look up these terms really quickly, you realize they're synonymous with conversion therapy. But again, this is the language that they use to really obfuscate or mask the dirty work that they're doing. Now, the other category that conversion practitioners use is, again, religiously coded. And the terms that they use under the second category are really one of three. These are terms that include biblical counseling, biblical worldview counseling, and pastoral counseling. And if you see these terms used in relationship to gender or sexuality, right? If you look on, I don't know, a church's website and they say that they offer biblical counseling for those who are exploring gender and or sexuality, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, what they're referring to is conversion therapy. So again, these are the dog whistles that for those of us with our ear to the ground, we know really are just synonymous for conversion therapy. Now, as for those of us, again, with our ear to the ground, whether we be researchers or activists or academics, allies, or survivors, the terms are, of course, different. The first term that we oftentimes use is conversion therapy. right? This is probably the most legible or easily recognizable term that most folks out there, they're familiar with this term, conversion therapy. They know in a general sense what this is. But there are other terms we use, and oftentimes we use them interchangeably. And these terms include conversion efforts, conversion practices, SOGIES, which stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression change efforts, which is quite a mouthful. So instead of that, we either use the term SOGIES or just change efforts for short. So these are some of the terms that I'll be using again tonight interchangeably. And I invite you to use whichever term you feel most comfortable with. Some people don't like using the term conversion in any sense. So change efforts really just satisfies. But again, it's really up to you what term you want to use. So offered a little bit of a vocabulary list, again, for both practitioners and those who are against conversion therapy. As for what exactly conversion therapy is, again, I think most folks in this Zoom room have a general sense or a very specific sense of what it is. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, conversion therapy at its core are efforts to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression. Right? These are subtle or blatant, formal or informal efforts to repair, reduce, suppress, change normative genders or sexualities, right? In attempts to achieve quote unquote heterosexuality or heteronormativity, as if these are goals for those who are involved. And all conversion efforts really are undergirded by a conversion ideology, which posits that queerness is ultimately incomplete, broken, sick, sinful, and/or degenerate, right? Queers, these are pejorative beliefs and teachings about queerness that frame it as something that needs to be fixed, something that needs to be changed. And so conversion practitioners oftentimes identify a number of sources or causes for queerness, right? They say that typically, and perhaps the most common source or cause for queerness, according to conversion ideology, is a damaged or incomplete relationship with one's parents, or just one parent, right? A mom or a dad. And so they're really drawing upon pseudo-Freudian understandings of human sexuality, and saying that one's relationship with one's dad or with one's mom or both is the cause for one's queerness. There are other theories, including the idea that damaged relationships with one's siblings is a cause, that negative experiences with the quote unquote opposite sex, this can be a cause, according to conversion therapists, for queerness, right? So if a guy is repeatedly rejected by women, he's going to go to Plan B and become queer. This is again one of the ideas that's in circulation. The idea that pornography causes homosexuality, the belief that negative spiritual influences, i.e., demonic possession, is a cause for homosexuality or gender diversity. The idea that a predatory member of the same sex, quote unquote same sex, is a cause for queerness, right? So a lesbian gym teacher preys upon a young girl, she becomes a lesbian. A predatory, babysitter preys upon a young boy, and boy, he becomes queer. These are some of the beliefs, these are some of the ideas for where queerness comes from, according to conversion ideology. Now, conversion practices seek to address these different sources or causes. And the practices, conversion practices run the gamut. Typically, what you're going to find in the most common effort to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression is through talk therapy or counseling, right? This therapeutic clinician's approach to, talking it out with, in a therapeutic context, an individual's, again, queerness. That's, again, perhaps the most common, but there are other forms of conversion therapy. There are other practices that fall under this umbrella. These include aversion therapy, right? Connecting something negative with one's positive, with something positive, with one's sexuality or one's gender. Perhaps the best known form of aversion therapy, and one of the most barbaric instances of aversion therapy, is electroshock therapy, something that continues to happen today. And so that's another practice that folks employ in order to change an individual. There's also support groups, camps, inpatient programs. These, again, constitute conversion practices. Coercive sexual relations, i.e. forced rape. This is a form of conversion therapy. Coerced sexual relationships. putting folks into mixed orientation marriages as a way to address an individual's non-normative gender or sexuality. Corrective prayer is a form of conversion therapy. It's oftentimes associated with exorcisms, and also forced celibacy constitutes a conversion practice. So, of course, these are some of the practices that are, again, undergirded by conversion ideology, and the consequences for these conversion practices are legion, right? There's psychological, social, physical consequences, and I'll offer, again, just a few, but this is not an exhaustive list. But some of the consequences of conversion therapy are guilt, shame, anxiety, depression, difficulty celebrating queer identity, difficulty in romantic and or sexual relationships, isolation, poor self-esteem, which is oftentimes connected to self-loathing, disruption in family relationships, anger, suicidal ideation. I actually should say lifetime suicidal ideation. Research suggests that folks struggle with suicidal ideation throughout their entire life as a consequence of conversion practices. There's a greater chance of folks abusing drugs or alcohol, increased risk of experiencing homelessness. Again, the list sort of goes on, right? These are some of the psychological, some of the social consequences. Physical consequences, there's increased chances of bulimia and anorexia. There is also, if we're thinking about aversion therapy, this is certainly something that I think that's obvious, the physical consequence. Now, to give you a bit of a history of conversion practices in North America, we have to rewind to the mid-1800s. And in the mid-1800s, the words homosexual and heterosexual come into the modern lexicon for the first time. Up until this point, sexuality was only really understood in terms of acts or actions, not so much in terms of identity. So when the mid-1800s hits and we start to understand homosexuality as an identity category and heterosexuality as an identity category, people start theorizing, well, where the heck did these things come from? Right. And obviously, very quickly, they understood homosexuality in pejorative terms, something that needs to be fixed. And so people start theorizing, okay, how do we address these quote unquote problems? We fast forward to around the time of the turn of the century. Freud is really coming into vogue, and he's starting to think about human sexuality, and people are spinning sort of ideas off of him. And some of the theories are really just in circulation, but what people start doing is, again, not just thinking about where do these things come from, but addressing these, these problems. Really, we're talking about sexual diversity as a problem. And so some of the first conversion practices in the North American context include forced lobotomies. And if we're thinking specifically in the context of Canada, testicular transplantation was a conversion practice that was used. So using or taking the testicles of a man who was presumed to be straight, and then implanting those in a homosexual man as a way of, again, changing this individual sexual orientation. Of course, we know that this didn't work, but this was, again, these were some of the first medical practices used in order to change individuals and align them with the heteronormative model. We fast forward to the 50s. This is when the DSM first comes out. And in the DSM, it codifies homosexuality as a pathology. And when something's codified in a manual like the DSM, of course, it has, again, an air of credibility there's a sense that this is scientific. Therefore, people, again, they're not just, there were, again, I should say, there were, of course, a number of ideas and approaches to changing individuals. But this is where, once it's codified in the DSM, more theories start to proliferate. And around this time, the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, early 70s, I should say, people were thinking, some of the theories that were really popularized were the idea that early childhood trauma, sexual trauma, caused homosexuality. Another theory that really that was in vogue at the time was the idea that an overbearing mother is the cause for a young boy's homosexuality, that the young boy, because of the mother, really lived in the world of femininity. And by the time that boy hit puberty, he went for what was quote unquote opposite of him. Of course, we're talking about a very binary understanding of gender and sexuality, that he went for what was opposite, which would have been masculinity. So this is where these two theories, again, really start to take hold. We, of course, know that both of these theories have been since debunked. However, conversion practitioners to this day still use these theories, and they are still in circulation. So we fast forward to, again, 1973. So 1973 is an important year for two reasons. One, the DSM declassifies homosexuality as a pathology. Of course, a very important moment in queer history and also medical history. But 1973 is, if we take a step forward in that sense, we take a few steps back in the other sense, because in 1973, this is where Jesus hits the scene. So what happens is the first ex-gay ministry in North America forms. I should say that the first ex-gay ministry actually formed in Australia, but if we're thinking about the North American context, the first is in Southern California, Love in Action, which persisted for a number of years, really was one of the most prominent inpatient programs that we know of. And so Love in Action forms in 1973. 1974, this is when Exit forms. Exit is the ex-gay interventionist team, or pardon me, intervention team. And these two organizations, as well as a number of others that start to pop up across the US, come together in 1976. It's in 1976 that the biggest and most influential ex-gay ministry forms, and that is Exodus, which eventually became Exodus International, which had branches and chapters across the world, across Canada, across the US and beyond. And so really the 70s is the shift between the secular context for conversion practices into the religious. And what I mean by that is that these ex-gay ministries were not drawing upon psychological or psychiatric or medical approaches to changing individuals. Instead, they were drawing upon theological explanations for homosexuality and theological interventions to change an individual. So through the transformative power and salvific power of Jesus' blood on the cross, people were able to change their non-normative sexualities and or genders. This really is the case for much of the 70s. Once we get into the end of the 70s and into the 80s, this is where ex-gay researchers hit they come into the picture. And I use the term researchers very loosely. But nonetheless, we have these ex-gay ministries and these ex-gay researchers. They form this symbiotic relationship. The ex-gay ministries latch on to the writings and the teachings of these ex-gay researchers, right? And it affords them, at least in their own estimation, a sense of credibility, right? That they have folks who have PhDs who are writing about this. This, again, legitimizes that what they've been saying for years. It's just now marrying the theological with the psychological. So they gain, again, this credibility. Whereas the latter group, the ex-gay researchers, what they get is money. All of a sudden, they have people who are buying their tapes, who are buying their books, who are inviting them to conferences, to their churches, to their organizations. And so these two groups come together and they snowball into what becomes the height of the ex-gay movement. So the 80s into the 90s really is the height of the ex-gay movement in North America and really globally, at least in the sort of the Western world. And it's at the end of the 90s that we see some of the leaders of this movement, specifically those who were leading Exodus, fall from grace. So we have folks who are photographed in gay bars, or they are found out to be involved in meth-fueled orgies in motel rooms, and news of this hits. And of course, these folks immediately, run and abandon the movement. Some of them, on their way out from, in this time of their, when they fell from grace, they acknowledge publicly that the ex-gay movement was ineffective. Of course, we know that it was always ineffective, but these folks are now, again, poking a hole in that sacred canopy of, the ex-gay movement and I guess evangelicalism, white Christian fundamentalism, and white Christian nationalism more generally, saying that this never worked. And one would probably expect that, the ex-gay movement would fold with the leaders acknowledging that nothing, no one ever successfully changed their sexuality, their gender identity, and or gender expression. However, that wasn't the case, right? And what we see is from the late 90s into the early 2000s, some of these organizations are continuing to advertise to folks outside of their communities, right? So they're on billboards, they're on magazine covers, newspaper articles, claiming that folks can change, and they're again advertising their services to those outside of the conservative Christian world. But around the early 2000s, they start to turn inward. And they are not necessarily, again, as vocal about these efforts and what they're offering to, again, people outside of their communities because a number of reasons. One, queer activists and gay rights activists and, folks who are pushing for the advancement of queer rights are, again, much more vocal at this point. On top of that, research is coming out to suggest that none of these practices have been effective. And so a lot of these organizations start to turn inwards. By 2013, Exodus, again, the most prominent ex-gay organization, collapses. It closes its doors and off they go. Problem is that just because they close doesn't mean that the ex-gay movement goes away. A lot of the folks who were involved in Exodus and also similar sister ministries, they sort of splinter off into a bunch of ministries that persist until today. They haven't ended their dirty work. But again, increasingly, they are advertising and they continue to really advertise behind closed doors. Within church networks, within Christian ministries, again, they're really advertising to themselves and not publicly. There's perhaps one exception today of an ex-gay ministry that is really public facing, and you can look them up. They're quite active on social media, specifically Instagram. They're called the Changed Movement. They're coming out of California. I don't know what's going on in California, but there's something in the water for ex-gay ministries. But they're coming out of California, out of Redding, California, specifically out of Bethel Ministries, which is a charismatic Christian movement that part of what they do is, again, support the work of this ex-gay ministry called the Changed Movement. And they are the people out of any organization that is most public facing today. But again, most of these organizations really have turned inwards. Which makes it much more difficult to really address conversion practices when it's happening behind closed doors and not advertised. So that's a little bit of a history, a quick overview of conversion practices and conversion therapy in North America. And to think about numbers today, we have a few statistics that signal how many folks have undergone conversion therapy in North America. But I do want to trouble and question some of these stats, and I'll get to that in just a second. But first, I'll offer the statistics. In the context of Canada, there is limited research on conversion therapy, but what the research that we do have indicates that 4% of sexual minority men have undergone conversion therapy. We don't have the most up-to-date research and perhaps expansive research, so we don't know about all communities under the LGBTQ umbrella. We have only really, the research that backs up 4% of sexual minority men specifically have undergone conversion therapy. In the US, the number is larger. It's believed that 7% of LGBTQ communities have experienced conversion practices. This is coming out of the Williams Institute out of UCLA. And so these two numbers, again, I think are a really important starting point for when we have these discussions about conversion therapy. But I do, again, question their accuracy. And really the problem for me, at least in my perspective, is the problem of self-reporting. So we have two main issues as it relates to self-reporting. One, a number of folks who have undergone conversion therapy don't always understand their experience as conversion therapy. I can use myself as an example. I went through conversion therapy for 4 years. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. But I didn't understand my experience as conversion therapy until I got to grad school. Once I was in grad school, I was talking to a friend about my experience, and she said to me, well, wait a second, it sounds like you went through conversion therapy. And I, of course, at the time knew what conversion therapy was, but I never once thought about my experience falling under that rubric. And so for folks who are taking questionnaires or, filling out questionnaires, or folks who are surveyed, they don't always identify themselves as conversion therapy survivors. So when they're answering the questions, they're going to say, well, that's not me. I just met with a pastor for, X number of years. Of course, that can fall under the rubric of conversion therapy, but those folks don't necessarily know that, or I don't necessarily identify as such. That can impact the number or the percentages of that we have, or the stats that we have. The other problem is, as it relates to self-reporting, is participation of folks who are still in high control Christian communities. And I should say, as I should have said perhaps at the outset of this presentation, is that the vast, vast, vast majority of conversion practices today are happening in high control Christian contexts. And so if we're thinking about the vast, vast, vast majority of folks who are undergoing conversion therapy who have undergone conversion therapy, and we're thinking about, including them in this research, we're talking about a community that is highly skeptical, a community that does not trust scientific, medical, and research findings, let alone researchers themselves. right? We can think of COVID-19 as an example, that shows, that again, what was really a public health measure was understood as a political issue. These are folks who don't trust, again, research that's coming out about really a lot of things. And so, especially if it's a research project that's related to gender or sexuality, coming from especially a queer person or a queer organization, they're not going to participate. So we don't have numbers that necessarily accurately reflect those who have been subjected to and undergone conversion therapy. So again, I'm really thankful for those percentages that we have and those studies that we have. But again, I think that the number is significantly larger than those numbers indicate. And of course, in Canada, we have a national ban. In the US, over half the states have a national ban. But right now, there's a Supreme Court case that's being heard coming out of the state of Colorado that is about conversion therapy. And we can talk more about that after. But in either case, that's the current sort of political landscape for conversion therapy. Now, I always end my presentations with two things. One, my own story, which I'll get to in a second. And the other part is the research that has been done by two sociologists coming out of the state of Virginia, out of James Madison University, Christine Robinson and Sue Spivey. These are two phenomenal sociologists. All of their work as it relates to conversion therapy is publicly accessible. So it's not behind a paywall, or you don't have to be, affiliated with the university to access it. You can find all of it online. But one of their articles, which is titled Genocidal Intentions, which of course the title of this presentation is pointing to, this article, in this article, these two, Robinson and Spivey, they argue at its core, conversion therapy is motivated by genocidal intentions. And for a lot of folks, that sounds perhaps melodramatic or overdramatic or like histrionic. But I think when we break down their argument into layperson terms, it becomes pretty clear what they mean and the stakes that are involved. So really what these two are arguing is that at their, that conversion therapists, if they could have their way, queer folks would not exist, right? Queer culture, queer representation, queer communities, queer vitalities, queers themselves would not exist. Now, I'm not saying, and nor are Robinson or Spivey arguing that conversion practitioners are out there trying to commit bodily or physical genocide. Of course, there are people who are calling for the complete erasure and extermination of queers, but most conversion practitioners are not. But what they are arguing is that if these folks could have their way, we wouldn't be here. And so I think that when we talk about conversion therapy and we understand conversion therapy in these terms, that conversion practices are motivated by genocidal intentions, again, very specific and intentional language, they're motivated by genocidal intentions. We can understand that, again, the stakes are high and that there is a threat to queer communities across North America, across the world. And again, I think we have to understand, when we understand it in those terms, we can see that, again, there's a very pressing issue facing gender and sexual minorities. Now, to give you an idea of this research and where it comes from, a lot of it, again, is academically motivated. A lot of my research has been really centering on these topics, but it also comes from a personal place, and that is I went through conversion therapy for 4 years at Liberty University, Jerry Falwell's school. For those who know who Jerry Falwell is, you know what kind of school Liberty is and the work that man did. For those who don't know who Jerry Falwell is or Liberty University or what that school is, count your blessings. You don't want to. And so I was there for 4 years in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's a lot to say about the name Lynchburg, but we'll put a pin in that for now. And it was in Lynchburg on campus that I went through conversion therapy with a man by the name of Pastor Dane Emmerich. He was a paid university employee who was tasked with working with two groups of students. Those who were addicted to porn, you can't be addicted to porn. Those who were addicted to homosexuality, you can't be addicted to homosexuality. There's a lot of research, obviously, backs both of those claims up, but research doesn't necessarily inform these folks' worldviews. And so I went through both the one-on-one program, and then once I went to the group conversion therapy program at Liberty. I write about the group conversion therapy experience in my new book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. It came out last year. And in my next book, which I'm currently working on, a new anthology of stories about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity schools, I talk about my one-on-one experience in conversion therapy. I am more than happy to talk about my personal experience. A lot of people are perhaps nervous to ask if I'll talk about it. I absolutely will. Again, a lot of my time and energy is spent talking about these things, including my personal experience. So I'd be more than happy to field any questions. But I'm going to leave the presentation portion with a slide. But I do want to open up the floor to any questions. But here's my contact information for anyone who's interested. I am on social media, I'm quite active. And then also, if you feel like emailing me, have any questions or thoughts, I would love to hear from you. And I should say that the book, Same-Sex Attraction, here it is. This book, if you're interested, I can also put in the chat in a second. I'll just have to open up a Word document. I can send you a discount code for anyone who's interested. You just have to use the University of British Columbia Press's website, and you can use the discount code there. Anywho, I will put a cork in it for now, and I will open up the floor to any questions. I would love to hear from y'all and to chat.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for that very informative presentation. We really appreciated hearing your stories. I'm going to turn off the recording now and invite people to ask questions. Let me just